3.
Well, good evening, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all to the 7th of these online workshops. My name is Jennifer Leone. I am a AP government teacher. This is my 24th year teaching. And this is my second one of these that I am co-hosting. So I welcome you all here tonight. We do have quite a list of people that want to speak. So unlike in the past where we've been able to have a lot more discussion, I know we've got people that really want to be heard. So if we're moving along, it's not in disrespect to what you have to say. It's more about respecting everybody's opportunity to speak. So first I'd like to introduce Tom, who's my co-host, and give him a minute to introduce himself.
Hey, Jennifer, Tom Richey, and I teach in South Carolina. I've taught AP Government, AP US History, AP European History in South Carolina, and also dabble a bit with YouTube and, of course, produce like some online materials and stuff like that. Peter and I have had some really interesting conversations about this because this is one of those questions that's so nuanced. And of course, what I was telling Peter is my answer to this question seems to change a little bit every time I talk to him, because as the circumstances change, I wouldn't answer this question the same way tonight as I would have answered it 6 months ago, or especially not 5 years ago, I think. So I think this offers us an opportunity to have a really fruitful discussion. So glad to be here.
And you bring up a good point about when are you asking this question? And that's one of the things that I kind of find fascinating about this. So the question tonight is, should teachers share their politics? And I think that for our purposes, when you're answering that question, maybe distinguish between should we share our politics, not what the politics is, if that makes sense. I don't want to get into a fight here over people's politics at all. Now, Jacqueline, I'm going to give you an opportunity to talk to you, introduce yourself, because I know you need to skedaddle to go take a class.
Hi, I'm Jacqueline Brothers. I'm a teacher in Salem, Oregon, and I'm going into my 9th year of teaching. I teach primarily AP US Government and Politics. I've done the AP reading quite a few times, and I started the constitutional law program for our district. So for me, since I'm primarily a civics teacher and with what I do with students in the classroom, I try to keep my own political perspectives out as much as possible. Now, most of us who teach these classes, we have very strong, right, and deep-rooted passions in what we believe. And sometimes it may make us, blink our eyes once before responding to students. However, I think that playing devil's advocate to whatever the main bias in the classroom is at the time is key, and letting the kids explore how they feel. Now, of course, if something is just dangerous, or, I had a student one time in class say that they should be able to kill all people who are in the United States who are here illegally because they're here illegally anyway, so there shouldn't be anything against them. Of course, I stopped that, or would stop that conversation, and we had quite the conversation with the principal. But when it comes to the political ideas floating around the classroom, whether you're talking about legalization of marijuana, abortion issues, or just like this year in a 2020 election, I think it's really important to make sure that you're hearing all sides. Now, I've had classes, as I'm sure you guys have too, which are very one-sided. In those cases, I try to bring in as much information and credible sources from the other side as possible. What I found is that parents and usually administrators are very on board in making sure that there's a level playing field, or if they see that it is dipped one way, trying to even it out. My school, though, is pretty diverse, both socioeconomically and just in general culturally, with the different religious or no religious affiliations of many of our students and families. So I think that makes it a little bit easier to have that balance in my classroom. But again, I stay away from anything that I think. I tell my students when they graduate, we can become friends on social media. And at that point in time, I will be happy to talk to them about it. But I know when I was in high school, one of my teachers who actually inspired me to become a teacher, he told us he was a libertarian. And without looking into it, I started calling myself a libertarian because I loved him. And so I knew, well, if he was, I was too. And so I do my best to not do that to students.
Can I ask, do your leanings match those of the majority of your community?
No.
Okay.
The majority of my community is actually extremely split. In the last election, actually back in 2016, we went red and voted for Trump, where our state went blue. Otherwise, we're pretty much divided down the middle. But what's interesting is it's a very polarized community. It's extreme right and extreme left, where I'm a moderate. So it does make it interesting, and maybe that's why I enjoy, you know, kind of going back and forth and pushing kids and parents' buttons a little bit and making them think about things in a different way.
All right. Thank you.
Now, Jacqueline, I've got a question for you. As far as you said something about, you know, like when your students graduate, they can friend you on social media and stuff like that. Are they able to see any of your social media when you're, you know, when they're in school? Because that's one thing that I think has become a big deal in the last 4 or 5 years, that, you know, no matter how we, you know, approach things in our classroom, that it's very difficult for students, you know, not to see what you're saying when you're not there. So I was just curious about how that works in your district, or how you've got your stuff set up.
Great, thank you. Everything for me is private. In our district, they ask that we do not befriend anyone on social media or have social media accounts even for school. To interact with students, everything needs to be through the LMS platforms that we've been given. So for me, I mean, it is pretty private. Also, in playing devil's advocate and being more so a moderate myself and pushing students, they never really know where I'm coming from. And some of them have sent me some really interesting messages at the end of the year when they start seeing, oh, I looked back and you liked this post on Instagram, you know, that sort of thing, because they're good at creeping. You know, overall, I just think supporting kids and really following whatever passion that is, whether it is, you know, super conservative, super liberal, or somewhere in between, if they want to get involved, I'm all for helping them.
Have you considered changing that idea at any point in your career of how much you share or not share?
I think when I'm ready to share more is my time to leave the high school education setting. Just because, again, I feel that minds at that age are so malleable. And they want to sponge off of people they connect to, and I feel very good connections with my students. I don't want to influence them. So at that point in time, maybe I would move on to teach more in a pointed way, or getting involved in politics, since that is my passion, in some other, you know, some other regard. But my goal is to keep that as neutral as possible, just because, again, of my personal experience.
Understandable. Thank you.
Thank you.
Tom, your turn.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, I mean, there are really a lot of things to go into here, because I used to be, I know that you know, like back in the day, I remember back in 2008 when that election was coming up. You know, every once in a while, I'd hear a student say like, "Oh, who's he even supporting?" or whatever. And I actually voted third party in that election. I mean, that was one year where I was just, you know, it was really easy because I wasn't planning to vote for either one of the major candidates. But at the same time, I think that is very, you know, that's a very good way to go. Now, of course, for me, I have public social media accounts, and, you know, that's been one of those things that's been really interesting, in the sense that, you know, about 2015, 2016, I realized, like, yeah, you know, I don't really think that people care what I don't understand why anybody really cares what I think about stuff, as far as, you know, and even in the classroom. See, I think when we talk about sharing your politics, I made some notes before this, and what I was thinking is there are really like 4 ways to share your politics. Okay, first of all, your political orientation. You know, and I don't have a problem like telling my students generally, especially in a government setting, that, you know, I tend to lean right on a lot of things, not on everything, but generally that's my orientation. Now, as far as that goes, I think that that's useful for helping students identify implicit biases. You know, it's like I tell them that when I step into the classroom, you know, I try to put on a demeanor that is neutral, but none of us are going to totally do that. And I think that it is useful to an extent for students to, to know where implicit biases may be coming from. Now, the next thing is where we get into like issue or organizational advocacy. And sometimes I think it just depends on the issue. And I guess in my classroom, I think when I'm coming from it is like a first among equals, if they really want my opinion about something. Now, when it comes to something like abortion, I'm not going to talk about it. There are some issues that I'm just like, okay, my thoughts on this do not matter. They're not going to be constructive. But last year, for example, I had a class of 8 in AP government. So I think one thing that has to be taken into consideration is the size of the class. So if I had a class of 25, I don't really have to be involved in a discussion to keep it going. Whereas if I've got a class of 8, I might need to actually participate in the discussion in order to keep it going. And I think sometimes just being clear about, okay, this is where my potential biases are, but that's not going to stop me from playing devil's advocate and challenging someone no matter where they're coming from. Now, also, someone's partisan affiliation. Now, I think one thing that really just, is like candidate advocacy, or whether it's for or against a candidate in the classroom, I think that's something that should be avoided at all costs. Now, I used to tell students, and I don't know, like I said, my stances on this keep evolving. I used to tell students that I'd be glad to tell them how I voted after an election, but then that was when there was less polarization. So, it's like, okay, if you're curious, and we may move on to a time that gets to be lower polarization at some point. And then that, the rules will kind of change again. In this environment, I'm not sure whether I'd even, talk about how I voted in an election or something like that. And I also think that the community, like what you pointed out, Jen, in terms of, are you like pretty much in the middle of your community? Are your beliefs kind of typical for your community or typical in terms of what they expect? So in, being AP government teachers, like we could take any one of us here and ask questions like, you've got somebody's, race, ethnicity, region, were they raised in a religious household? What were the political leanings of their parents? And we could ask somebody, I've told students I can ask like 5 questions, and with about 90% certainty, I can tell you how you vote based on that information, the answer to those 5 questions. And one of the things I think is so important about AP government is trying to challenge, people's knee-jerk reaction to take someone else's politics personally, when really someone's politics are a result of so many factors that they didn't really even have control over. We know, like, even though we can make a difference, perhaps we can have some influence. If a student's got 2 parents that are politically active and they're both of the same political party, odds are that kid's got their mind made up before they come in. So I think that there are a lot of things to note, but I think one of the biggest things is I've seen with increasing polarization, I tend to get much more cautious about things. And of course, are y'all familiar with that? I've got it pulled up. I believe it was the Cato Institute. Are y'all familiar with this Cato Institute poll? I will, y'all probably are, but just a refresher there, that no matter where somebody is on the political spectrum right now, that the political climate these days prevents me from saying things I believe because others might find them offensive. And even with people who identify as, quote unquote, strong liberal, which what does liberal even mean anymore? But, you see that that's even gone to the point where a near majority there. But then when you see as you go farther to the right, now strong conservatives, even in 2017, but, when you think about moderates, it's about 60% are just not comfortable, expressing themselves. And I think that that's something. See, one other thing I would note here is one of the arguments for sharing at least your political orientation and maybe a few other things, if you feel like that's safe, is it models citizenship. That's something that for some of these kids, like seeing that, look, I'm not advocating anything. It's just, I'm being a citizen. But then again, you have to weigh polarization against that as well. So that's really where I'm coming from. But then again, if you ask me next week, I might have a slightly different answer for you.
Well, and I wonder, Tom, with that, and I understand how you could go back and forth with that. If you start sharing, then in 2 weeks you think, oh crap, what did I just do?
You know, that is something, and like maybe something you say like at the beginning of the semester this day and age could not age well, you know, so that is something to think about as well if you want to be in kind of a timeless sort of mode. So that's where, yeah, I think that you've got a great point on that, you know, when those things are changing, then, you know, and that's the thing, like last semester when I had 8 students in my class and I'd taught those students before, you know, and we basically just would have discussions and I'd sit down and we were just discussing things. And, you know, there's always kind of a line you go up to and you're like, okay, I'm not going to go beyond this. But yeah, I think that's a good point. And part of it is knowing, you know, who your students are. But yeah, we've seen things can change a lot. It looks like Paul had his hand up over there.
Yeah, I have a quick question for you, and you know, I'm gonna posit essentially that that maybe as educational professionals we have a certain amount of ethics in terms of a baseline, in terms of what we share with the classroom versus what we don't share. In terms of boundaries. So we are bound as educational professionals to be educators, not to be proponents of one side or the other. So I'm going to take that as my own professional ethic. It doesn't have to be agreed upon, but we're here not to espouse, but to try to present education in its most objective way. And I know objectivism is not possibly attainable. I've been through the philosophy courses and that stuff. So what I'm having a hard time with is that what I'm seeing or hearing is the idea of situational ethics. This year I might share more. Next year I might share less, depending on what the political environment is. We are in a very difficult realm with regards to teaching. We're not teaching math. It's, you know, 2 + 2 is always going to be 4. So I guess I push back a little bit in the sense that. I think keeping the boundaries up for students, they feel safe in those boundaries. If they don't know what my professional ethics are, well, actually, I'm sorry, they should know what my professional ethics are. They have no idea what my political inclinations are. We can share stories and that might push them in one direction or the other, but I think being careful not to share a story that is going to alienate one group and then empower a different group and vice versa is really important. I want my students who are 17, 18-year-old in that really tentative process of political socialization, moving away from parents possibly and moving away into a realm of their own choices. I want them to be empowered. And how do we do that? But at the same time, be aware of the power that we have as educators to sway.
Yeah, I think you and I generally agree on that. Like as far as, you know, there being a boundary. And I think that, you know, when it comes to an attempt to influence, you know, that is definitely like a hard boundary. You know, candidate advocacy, hard boundary. Anything that's not edifying. Now the other thing is I think that we
know that candidate advocacy and issue advocacy is almost one and the same.
And I don't get into issue advocacy in the classroom. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, I in the classroom, I wouldn't do that. So I think that's something where you're saying like, oh, well, I support this. For example, like we were talking about the Second Amendment in class today. And of course, you know, I've gone and traveled to Europe several times, you know, in the past 5 years, of course, before Corona and all that. But, you know, my own views of the Second Amendment are rather nuanced. But when it comes down to it, you know, you have to like go down the middle on that and give, you know, realizing that you've got people that are all over the place on that, you know, that you've got, you know, if you've got a class of 20 kids, you're going to have, you know, all the way here, all the way here. You know, we looked at that picture of that couple in St. Louis, you know, during the summer. And it's like, okay, what do y'all think about this? And looking at like the man and the woman and, you know, getting the kids really to sound off on, you know, what do you think about that? Which one of these two looks, you know, more threatening? Like, do you think that there's a difference between the way that, you know, you had like the man who is standing in front of his house with a high-powered rifle, but every picture I've seen, he's just holding it. Whereas this woman really does appear to be waving the gun at people and, you know, getting their thoughts, you know, about where do you think the boundary is there that, you know, you've got, you know, between the right to defend your property, but then, you know, where you are threatening someone unnecessarily. So I think that it's not so much the teacher's place to build the narrative there as much as to start a conversation with students. And I think that every once in a while, and like you were saying something about stories, I remember my favorite teacher in high school, you know, told us one time about how they decided like Jimmy Carter was flying in. I guess he was campaigning in like 1976 or 80, and they wanted to meet him, and they said it was raining, like it was a heavy rain outside, but Jimmy Carter like came off the plane and shook hands with them. And he was explaining to us how like he voted for Jimmy Carter, even though in most elections he, you know, and it was pretty evident, you know, what his implicit biases were. You know, he wasn't in the business of indoctrinating, but you could kind of tell this guy was right wing. It's like you're not stupid, but at the same time he was like, look, you know, and the point that he was making, you know, there was a constructive point in saying that, you know, if you are running for office and you are approachable and you make that effort, that it's not really going to matter as much, you know, your politics, as somebody's going to appreciate that effort you're making. And with that story, he was a little bit vulnerable, but at the same time, it was something that stuck with me. You know, there are some things that, you know, I may not have remembered from his class, but that was something that, you know, this really transcendent moment that I thought was pretty beautiful. And without knowing anything about, like, if I didn't know anything about his political orientation or hadn't been able to connect the dots, it wouldn't have been as meaningful as the story that he ended up telling.
Well, I think that's really important, the power of story in the classroom. And this is something that, Peter, you might want to consider later as a different add-on. The stories that we tell, the narratives that we have, can be really powerful to students, probably more so than the lectures or the projects that we do. Those stories can be really, and I like the word indoctrinating, and you know, in a sense that that's a really powerful way of getting to students. And we have to be careful in terms of the stories that we tell, and really be cognizant of the stories that we choose to tell can really shape and sway the outcome of a student's idea. So it's hard to actually to navigate that at the same time. So I appreciate that comment. Thank you.
So a number of years ago, a couple of my students, when they had graduated, came to me, speaking of stories, and said, you know, when we were in Miss So-and-so's government class, she referred to the president as the devil incarnate. And I was like, okay, like I honestly didn't know what to say. And they said to me, so it was real obvious where her ideology lied, where her politics lied in all of this. They said, but we can't figure you out. And these are kids that I had in 9th grade, and then I had them again in electives their senior year. They're like, we have no idea. Where are you? And I was like, well, I think I've done my job, is what I was thinking. I said, you graduate, you come back, and maybe we'll chat. But until then, it's, Paul, like you were saying, I don't think I don't want to say it's unethical, but for me it is. For me, there's a line that I don't feel that I can cross with that, because I don't want a student to ever, like Jacqueline was saying, call themselves a libertarian because I said I was, or call the president the devil because this teacher said he was, or the exact opposite and run the other way. I feel I played devil's advocate in my class as much as I can. And every once in a while I will catch myself and I stop and I think, am I playing devil's advocate equally? Or can they see my bias even when I'm doing that? And I try to be very cognizant of that. And so far, I think I've been pretty successful because the kids have no clue. They really don't. And Tom, to your point about showing, your civic duty, today I pulled out mine and my daughter's, our applications for absentee ballots. Because in Ohio, you're allowed to get an absentee ballot just because. So I had both of the applications. They're signed, sealed, ready to be put in the post office. Then I said, here they are. And when I get my ballot, I'll bring my ballot in. Or I'll print it off, because we can print off copies of what it's going to look like before you go in. So you can see, yes, I do go vote. And this is what this looks like. And this is how I do this. But what you will never see is a political sign in my yard, because you just won't. I just don't feel like I'm a public employee. My husband's a public employee. I just don't feel like, to me, it's crossing the line. And that's my own ethical line. And I don't even live in the same district that I work in. But there's just certain lines that I don't want to say I'm afraid of that indoctrination word, but I don't want to be somebody who unintentionally does that. Like, you don't want to unintentionally hurt somebody by making a humorous remark. You think it's humorous, the student takes it personally. To me, it's almost the same thing.
Yeah, those can be actually even more caustic.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, one thing I want to ask, and that's kind of a good point that you're making there, Jen. Actually, a really good point in the sense that it was something I wanted to bring up as well. When we talk about ethics, for example, my school district says that you can have bumper stickers on your car. It's like you can have your car parked in the school parking lot. You are allowed to have stickers on your car advocating issues, advocacy, issues, candidates, whatever. And when I was younger, I used to, political season, I'd have something on my car. Now I no longer do that. That's a personal choice. And that's one of those, Paul, when you mentioned like, situational ethics, like I'll go ahead and wear that to an extent, to the point that, when things get to be more and more polarized, I understand that when there's polarization, people will take your political views personally. It's like they see something, they will say like, look, I see that, and I'm attaching my meaning, and they make an assumption. So, I do see in our teacher parking lot, there are, bumper stickers this election cycle. And I've just like, I don't really feel like that is a good thing for me to participate in. But I did want to see if there are any of y'all, like, as far as the policies in your districts, because that is one of those gray areas where teachers are given that leeway. If you want to have your car full of bumper stickers, and at least in my district, you're allowed to do that.
Can I jump in here for a second? We've had a really interesting development in our district that follows from what you were just saying there, Tom. Is what about the BLM signs, and whether they can and teachers should be allowed to place those in their classroom? We have some who want to go that route, have gone that route. We do have a district policy of no sharing political opinions, and yet on the other hand, we know it's happening. The district hasn't yet told those teachers explicitly to take down those signs, but there sure have been some pretty good nudges in that direction. I just want to put that out there. Curious where you guys sit with that question about those signs and whether teachers should be allowed to put those up.
Well, I work in a Department of Defense school, and I was very surprised. Over the summer, we received an entire educational suite, I guess you would call it, like a whole packet of resources on social justice education. And I went in and investigated. It was a lot of very deep and serious literature and resources about social justice, about inequity. And some of it was authored by one of the Dodia Teachers of the Year, who's a very strong advocate for social justice. And that came from our agency headquarters. And then last week or the week before, we kind of got a conflicting message because the federal government was told that that kind of educational, like the workshops that they would do, workplace employment education workshops within the federal government were now all being banned. And, you know, I went and I looked at the two and they seemed like they were in conflict with one another. But when I saw that over the summer, I was a little bit, I felt like they had given us a little bit more freedom to bring those issues up in the classroom. Whereas in a federal school, especially working with a lot of military families, you know, you have a very wide mix of political backgrounds, political opinions, and I was always very careful with that stuff. But I felt like we were getting kind of like acknowledgement that it was okay.
Now that's something, I guess, you know, where we, you know, whether you're, you know, told that, because I've gotten some things before too, like at my school, you know, I'll check my box once in a while and they're like teaching materials from the Southern Poverty Law Center. And, you know, and that's obviously coming from, you know, that's not coming from a neutral position. And, you know, but you're getting those materials. Of course, that's one thing. And I don't know, Tim, if this is connected with what we saw on social media last week about, you know, the Department of Education talking about, for example, like the 1619 project, you know, and you know, whether schools were using that. And I need to look a little more into, you know, into that. I mean, but I've seen some, you know, mainstream, you know, left of center historians that have, you know, looked at that and not, you know, not been too impressed with it, but I haven't looked at it closely enough to come up with a verdict. But it is something where, you know, whether you can do it or not, do people feel like that's a good idea? Like you're, you know, and Peter, what I'm thinking about is when you think about like Baker versus Carr and what the Supreme Court had in front of them, like, you know, the hesitance of, you know, like Justice Frankfurter, for example, in his dissent, he was like, look, the court has gotten into a political question here, that the court has, and I think that's why it's one of our 15 cases, that when it comes to a question of justice, at what point does that cease to be a political question? And it would be great to hear that perspective from somebody, if we've got somebody here that wants to give that perspective, because personally I feel like, okay, that's, you know, I want to at least attempt to be more neutral, but is there anybody that wants to, you know, defend that sort of position?
So thank you. This is great. I've been listening attentively to what everyone has been saying, and this is great stuff. I guess I come from a slightly different perspective. I teach at a private school in Massachusetts, and my background is in journalism and history. I have an MA in history as well. I teach government and U.S. history, and for a long while, I chose to be opaque with how I expressed myself politically. But you know, I'll just say it. I think we live in extraordinary times. I don't think we've ever had a president quite like Trump, no matter where you are politically, and I don't want to engage in that discussion with folks either here. I don't offer my opinions freely, but if students ask me for my thoughts, I give it to them, because I feel that if I remain silent, that either is me condoning an action or showing apathy toward inaction, or inaction as the case may be. And I also think that because I'm teaching older students, mostly juniors and seniors, it shows that I respect their intellectual maturity by sharing my views. Now, having said that, I don't really share my views at all on policy issues. So I agree with what Tom and some others have said about that as well, Paul as well. I think that's where I would feel like I would be crossing the line. But when it comes to rhetoric and behavior, now I think everything's political these days. If students ask me my thoughts, you know, I'll tell them, and I won't hold back, and I'll be, you know, forthcoming with it. You know, I think that's been met with the spirit in which it was intended from people on both sides of the political spectrum, students from the left and students from the right. Having said that, even after I share my thoughts on rhetoric and behavior from our commander-in-chief, students still can't really tell where I reside politically. I'll tell you folks, I'm a Romney Republican. I am not a Trump supporter, but I don't tell students that. And I've written about this quite a bit and why I feel it's necessary to speak out. But yeah, so I do on rhetoric and behavior and language coming from the president, which I deem abhorrent. And as an educator, I feel that staying silent is letting students know that this type of behavior from our leaders is acceptable. So maybe that's a contrary point of view, but that's where I'm at.
Hey, David.
Dave,
Dave-
you're a man off.
I think
Sorry.
Yeah.
I think that there's a lot to unpack there, and I see, Adam, you've got your hand raised, and I want to get back to that. I want to give Carlo a few minutes to talk first, though, and then I think we can come back, because now we're talking about politics versus behavior, and there might be a line there. I mean, that might really be two separate.
Yeah.
Sorry, Dave's a man after my own heart. I'm from Massachusetts, Dave. I probably am 30 miles from where you are, so we can commiserate later. My parents shifted from hardcore Kennedy supporters to Romney in the early 2000s.
Yeah.
But there's a lot to unpack there.
Sure.
As Jen said. Yeah, and that's really cool, actually. Those stories are cool to share among colleagues, but probably not cool to share among students. Because I'm not sure they actually are sophisticated enough to understand that and can be swayed one way or the other. Carlo, sorry, I jumped over your.
Oh, you're okay. Good afternoon or good evening to some of y'all on the East Coast. My name is Carlo Juntilla. I teach on the West Coast here in the San Francisco Bay Area, school in Richmond, California, and I teach predominantly lower income Latinx students. And so, my context is just different from all of y'all. So I don't, in the classroom, I teach 11th and 12th grade social studies, so AP US history and government. And so I don't ever want to tell my students how to think, but I do think that it's appropriate, to let them know how I think, because I practice the skill of authenticity in my classroom. I welcome my students showing up as their authentic selves in the class, and I want to create an environment where they can be vocal about what's important to them. And I model that by saying what's important to me based on my own experiences, my own identity. So when the President of the United States says something that directly threatens the well-being of my students, particularly my students who come from historically underrepresented backgrounds, I refuse to be neutral in those situations. I've heard in the past, and educators of my own have taught me, that it's important to practice neutrality, but neutrality in itself, I believe, is a political decision. Education at its core is inherently political, and everything from our textbooks, our curriculum, the policies that inform our pedagogy is politically and ideologically informed, and we can't pretend to ignore that that's the context in which we teach. So as a social studies teacher, I believe I have the immense, power to shape the minds of my students, but I refuse to make them believe one thing or another. What I want my students to be able to do is develop the skills of how do you think critically, and how do you create your own perspective on certain issues. But I do want them to know when racist, sexist, and xenophobic language is used, it's wrong regardless of your political affiliation. So like what David said earlier, by being silent on those issues, I worry that my students believe that will lead to my apathy or, a certain belief towards those issues. So, I struggle because I want my students to feel authentic. I want my students to be able to voice their opinion. And I do come from and teach in an area where many of my students have the same political views on certain issues. So I welcome in discourse from other political views, but at the same time, again, right, like these messages that we're hearing shouldn't necessarily be political regarding like the well-being of my own students. And so, for example, when we talk about Black Lives Matter in my classroom, I have a Black Lives Matter poster right here. You can't really see it, but it's right there. And I have it in my classroom because we teach predominantly Latino students. And when I have one or two students who are Black in my class and they don't feel, we have a certain issue on our campus of not necessarily being inclusive towards our Black students, that messaging in itself is just super powerful in letting my students know that, right, like this isn't just like a political stance, this is just recognizing your humanity. And so that's how I approach the classroom. I do struggle sometimes. I worry about indoctrination, of course, because I want my students to be able to develop their own critical thinking minds. And so I welcome in all perspectives. But again, I draw the line when things threaten the safety and well-being of my students.
I would echo Carlo's comments. He's very eloquent and very concise. The only thing that I would shift the conversation to, it's not the consensus over what we're trying to do, because I think we probably agree in terms of trying to develop critical and educated citizens. It's how we do that. And that becomes the crucial question in terms of what is it that we do, and how do we encourage every student to be critical thinkers? How do we to truly go back to the Madisonian concept of republicanism, to be civically engaged and voice their opinion? And I actually hate the word opinion. Voice their ideas, and vote. And I tell my students at the beginning of every year, and I just started my classes last week, I'm like, the only thing I really want from you is to become registered voters and to actually vote from now until you drop dead. And that's it. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, Carlo, I guess I just, in the interest of playing devil's advocate, I guess the question I would have is, what if there were a teacher that felt like that was very strongly pro-life and believes that, like, hey, this is not something I can be neutral about. You know, they believe that this is the mass murder of the unborn. And what, you know, I guess I'm thinking, what would you think about a teacher who's like, look, I'm not going to be neutral on this issue because I believe it's a justice issue. Like, and I'm just really wanting to hear what you'd have to say to something like that, as much as not really looking for a particular answer.
No, I appreciate that perspective, because I think it goes back to the idea of showing up authentically in the classroom. Whenever I talk about my own political perspective on an issue, I root it in my own experience and my own identity. So when another teacher would like to, you know, voice their opinion on being pro-life, I would hope that they do so in the same regard, right? Explaining why they believe this, because I feel like my students need to be able to do the same thing, right? When they take a political stance on an idea, they need to be informed by facts, their own experiences, and their own identity, and that self, right? And so when I model that for my own students, I want them to be able to think critically about what other people have to say. So for example, if my student is pro-choice and they hear an educator or somebody who is significant in their lives explain a pro-life position, I want them to be able to think critically about, why do they think that way? How does it contradict against my values? How can we have a civil conversation regarding that topic?
Okay,
Right.
yeah, and I think I can vibe with that a lot, in the sense that, you know, it sounds like your demeanor is what I would call like the first among equals. You know, it's like you're putting your views out there, but it's very obvious to all of the students that everything is safe, you know, in the classroom to express things. Because there are sometimes, you know, so for example, when I'm teaching, did any of y'all teach U.S. history, or is it just me? Okay, because these tend to overlap. And when I'm teaching U.S. history, you know, when we get to the Civil War, I just have to, you know, I always tell my students, I'm like, look, you know, my 3X great-grandfather was a Confederate veteran, you know, and, you know, I've got deep roots here, and y'all need to consider that, because there are so many perspectives about the American Civil War, and it's such a complex issue that, you know, and for me, that's just part of, you know, showing up authentically and just saying, like, look, this is where you might be able to see implicit biases. And then there are also, you know, conversations such as, I mean, I'm wondering in terms of, I've talked to some other teachers about what we've seen with monuments and such. And so what's happened to the monuments, where there is a due process in a lot of places, you know, for example, like the state of Virginia, like that law kicked in over the summer, and there is a due process that you're seeing in places like Charlottesville. And what does a teacher do in a situation like that? You know, that's something that I think is, you know, and let me just put that out there. Like, how do you get into a discussion like that in a classroom over, like, you know, a crowd taking down a monument versus pursuing due process? You know, I see you've got your hand up, Paul.
Yeah, I want to go back to one of your original points in terms of how we address these issues that are super sensitive, like the Roe v. Wade decision. I think in the context that we're in, and I go back to that idea of ethical ethical pinnings, we understand this as a jury of 9, if you will, or a Supreme Court of 9 deciding what the idea of human is, right? And so as government teachers, we actually have a dedication to say, here's the power of the courts. here's the power of the course to go back to Dred Scott and say, here's the definition of a human being, be they white or black. Here is the power of the course to decide when human conception actually starts. So I teach in a Catholic school, and obviously the Catholic identity with Roe v. Wade is completely contrary to that decision. And so I have to really tread lightly, but at the same time, I'm not afraid to take that issue on. But I will treat it in a civics course. I will not treat it in a moral course. And I've really good friends of mine who are strong and smarter than I with regards to their philosophy and their theology. But I will treat it simply as, this is how the courts decide this. And this is the power of the courts. And if we step back and look at this and say, wow, man, the 9 people in the Supreme Court can decide what it is to be human, and we start to look at the power of that, then we're getting into a really discussion in the class to say, wow, what are we beholden to? So I step away from the actual moral and theological understandings of that, and step back into the civics and say, here's the power of our institution. I know it sounds clinical, but it's a safe place for me to be.
I want to give Adam a chance to talk before we run out of time here.
Sorry.
He's been waiting patiently.
Hi,
I'm very
everyone.
patient.
And my name is Adam Kubey. I teach APGov and Gov Econ in the Bay Area. So me and Carlo are on the east side of the Bay. I'm originally from Chicago, Illinois. I was born and raised there and grew up there. And I taught there for 5 years before moving out to the Bay Area. I guess my opinion of this comes, and my, beliefs on this comes from having taught in Chicago during the 5 years. During those time periods, the issue of gun violence and deaths by guns was a really big issue. And, it was on the minds of all my students day to day. And that issue worked its way into the classroom. And I'm an action civics teacher, so I spoke a couple of weeks ago about action civics. And you have to have an opinion about that to understand the humanity of your students. If they're fearful of their lives on their way home from school and to school every day, and the issue is gun violence with them, and you don't state that you are also concerned about gun violence and that you are also concerned about their safety going home and the safety of their family, you're not recognizing their humanity. You're not recognizing their concerns, and you're not recognizing what they're going through. And so to not have an opinion about that in my classroom was just not didn't make me feel good, or it didn't make me feel that it was an educational for them, because they needed to know that I was with them, and I needed to know that I was fighting with them for this issue. So having taught action civics, I got my students to work on campaigns. And the first election was the 2008 campaign. I took students to Wisconsin, and the group that I was chaperoning was working on the McCain campaign. And I had a young lady from right down the street from Obama's house who the dice was rolled, and she got put on the McCain campaign. She dressed herself up in a McCain Palin shirt. She had all these stickers on, and she went and campaigned for McCain. And this person came up to her and said, "You're a young black lady from Chicago. How are you campaigning for McCain?" And she says, "You know what? I'm here to learn about campaign. I'm here to learn about the system." And I got put on the McCain campaign. It doesn't matter who I'm voting for. I'm going to learn about how a campaign works. And that really struck me as this young lady who was down the street from Obama, and Obama was a hero, but she was going to learn about campaigning, and she was going to work on the McCain campaign. And bringing that type of atmosphere is the learning process. That my classroom is a classroom of learning, and we talk about building empathy and building relationships and building understanding of each other, which Paul and Peter did as the first session that we did. And if you build that into the classroom, then the students understand who you are as a teacher, who they are as students in the classroom. Then I moved out here and go to the 2016 election, and Trump gets elected president. And I don't discuss my politics. I don't discuss who I'm going to vote for. I discuss, as Dave says, your values. You discuss how you feel about students and their families. And my students walked out, and the next day after the election, and they wanted to talk about immigration. They wanted to talk about what was going to happen. And for me to not say that I was for their humanity and that was for them, whether they're documented or undocumented, being a part of my class, being a part of our community, was not an option. Again, this goes to LGBTQ also. my students are openly gay and openly trans, and I want to show them that I believe in their humanity and their right to be in that classroom, and that means that I believe in their rights. So those types of issues come into the classroom, and I have to recognize that this is how I feel about those. That doesn't mean we're not there for the learning process. That doesn't mean that students are not able to express themselves and their views on policies or on issues in a way that helps learn. And I promote and bring perspectives into the class and opinions. One of my students back in Chicago came back to me at the end of the year and says, I hate you, Mr. Kubey. And I said, what are you talking about? And he's wearing an elephant on his shirt. He says, I found out that I'm a Republican and I hate myself. And I said, that's great. That's who you are, you know. And he learned in my class that he believed in those values and he believed in what the Republican Party stood for. So it wasn't that I made him feel uncomfortable. He had been taught his whole life that Republicans are bad. And in his class, in my class, he realized through what we were talking and learning that he believed in those values. And I think that that's important, that students are able to explore in the class, be able to learn in the class, share who they are, share what their feelings are and their opinions on things, and then go out and do it. But again, I'm an action civics teacher, so kids are working on campaigns. The last story I want to bring is I contact every campaign that's on the ticket and from every side. And during the 2016 election, nobody called me back. The Trump campaign never called me back. Nobody. So a Republican that was running for Congress called me back, and I asked him if I could bring my students to work on his campaign. And he said, well, what are your students? I said, what do you mean, what are my students? He said, well, what are the demographics? I said, I have a 50% Latino population, a 40% Asian population, 10% Black population. He says, well, I can't guarantee their safety if they come work on my campaign. And I said that my kids aren't coming on your campaign to work. If you can't guarantee that my kids are going to learn and they're going to be safe while they're learning about the campaign, then I'm not bringing them there. So I always get them involved in working on multiple campaigns. I always get them involved to be involved on multiple sides of the issues. Actually purposely make sure they do both sides. So they work on one campaign one weekend, and the next weekend they're working on the opposing campaign. And they learn that way. But I think that what I wanted to bring to this is the idea that we need to make sure that students feel comfortable and heard in the classroom, and that they're recognized whoever they are. And that may bring a policy issue, that might bring a certain stance on things. And they need to know that I recognize that there should be in that classroom, and they should be comfortable, and their views should be heard. That's the only thing I really do. I think that was brought up before about certain topics that I think the safety issue. I don't think that's usually, that's obviously you would call administrators who talk to if this was a safety issue, but I think that when a student is not recognized for who they are and that they are allowed to be in the classroom and they're allowed to have their voices heard, then I step in. And I said that's not a policy issue. They're a human. You need to recognize them, and they need to feel comfortable in this room. They're just a student just like you.
So I'm kind of hearing, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm hearing sharing politics as this is who I'm going to vote for and this is the ideology I believe in, versus, not necessarily versus, and approaching or looking at my classroom at like from a humanistic viewpoint. And I'm going to look at the humanity of my students and treat them all with civility regardless of policy. And
Yeah.
so I wonder if it's more recent policy that is in the news. Some policies have always been there, right? That makes this more of a in your face, in the front of your mind type of concern.
I don't think it's recent. Going back to what Carlo was saying and what Dave was saying, I think Carlo said it right about humanity, of him and being a human and them being humans, and that they need to feel that you are also that. We can go back to the civil rights movement. If I was teaching in the South in the 60s, I don't think that I would say that, we need to keep all things equal, and that we're going to agree with segregation is good just because it's the other side of the coin. And the Black students in the room and saying, okay, we're going to segregate. I don't know how you would do that, but I think that, I think it's always been the case that certain things are on one side or the other side, and we try to be bipartisan. I think we can be bipartisan and not be, we can also stand for what is right. And this goes back to what Carlo was saying about education, and that the education is to teach all those in the room, and to teach all those in the room what I wouldn't call it morally correct, but I think that there's certain values that go along with the right to education, the right to feel comfortable in the classroom, the right to feel that to recognize as who they are. So I don't think it's a political thing in this sense, because it doesn't have to be bipartisan. I don't think that is what it is. But I think that what we talk about is the value of the learning and the value of the education, and the value of them as a person. And as long as we recognize that, the policies, the discussions about partisanship, discussions about certain issues that are going on in society, whether it is Black Lives Matter, I think that we can have a discussion in our classroom around that. And I can recognize the humanity of my Black students, and that their lives matter, and that their lives are under threat right now, and still have a discussion about whether we should defund police, or whether we should have this conversation about what is the role, how do people of color treated by police in society when they're arrested. I think we can have those discussions and those deep conversations in political parties and vote, and what each candidate stands on, and which party stand on, and also understanding that we do believe that Black lives do matter. I think that that both sides, kids at this age, we're talking about juniors and seniors, can have those really, I can't think of the word right now, conversations, and understand the differences within them.
I think, honestly, the more questions we ask of our students, the better off they're going to be. And it goes back to that word indoctrination before. And Adam, I think that's where we're actually in agreement, in a sense that we want students to actually continue to ask those questions, because if they ask them in the classroom and feel comfortable asking them in the classroom, they'll ask them in society and become more inquisitive and more engaged. And that's all I ask for my students. I want more questions than answers. And it goes back to other conversations we had on Monday nights on assessment and that kind of thing. But I really want the students to continue that engagement, because once they feel like there's an answer, and we are the same way as human beings and citizens, we just stop asking questions. And it sounds like what you're doing in the classroom is actually asking the students to ask more questions as opposed to telling them the answers.
So here's, I want to put a plug in here. So in the Bay Area, my kids live in a bubble. Let's just be honest. And
I'm
so
just north of you.
I've used I made the same kind of conversation that we're having here at a civics conference here. And there was a tech company that's called Mismatch that works with Close Up. And what they do is they get students from different parts of the country to talk about the political divide, to talk about the issues, to talk about their values. And what I have found that is my students here in the Bay Area talking to students in Montana, North Dakota, Utah, that it was so good. The conversations were so fruitful, and they recognized that they had policy differences and political differences, and they're voting different. But they said that kid across the camera from them is a kid just like me, going to school and learning about politics and government. And we all need to get involved. We need to have these conversations. We need to build that we can. We believe that each one of us is worthy of the other person, and to have those deep conversations and talk. And then we all vote, and that works. And those watching those students and our students talk about it, and their students talk about it, and then kind of seeing that process go through. I think that we all need to do that. We're doing it right here. We have the technology for that, and hopefully. Part of the curriculum will be that students participate in some civil discourse with students who don't share the same political opinions, don't share the same demographics, don't share the same geography, and they learn from that. And I hope Mismatch is able to scale up and to allow our students to do that. But I would really love to have my students talk to your school students, Jen, and your students, Tom and Dave, and to have that. And I've done
that's a great forum, actually, moving forward.
I've done that. I've done it as like a group chat, but I think the one-on-one has been so powerful where the kids talk one-on-one to another student.
Yeah.
I'm going to put a plug in for Peter, just because he's put a lot of work into putting these groups together. So Peter, I just want to say thank you before we log off tonight.
I really
for all the work that you've done.
Thank you.
And you and I have had conversations, and some of them have gone well and some of them haven't. And Peter and I agree to disagree at times. But Peter, thank you so much for pulling us together on Monday nights. To do this kind of chat, and this is really important, and Tom, I'll reach out to you at some point, and we can have some conversations about a whole bunch of things.
Oh, that'd be great. That'd be great. Yeah, get in touch.
Shelby Foot. I want to be on one of your YouTube videos. That's my dream right now.
Okay, well, yeah, Peter,
and I'm gonna wear a beanie.
Yeah, make sure we can get in touch, Peter. And I wanted to thank Carlo especially. Carlo, you're earlier in your career, and you were like, you just came out and just said, hey, this is probably, not going to be what a lot of people are going to agree with necessarily, but you just put it out there. And I think that it had a role in, Adam, you kind of got set up there, like you were able to come in and speak, and, it's just great to see somebody like still, or like early career and being willing to just be the first person to say something different. So thanks for that.
If I could just,
Carlo's going to be around for a long time. I know that for sure.
Tom, you're talking about over your career making some shifts in terms of your thinking, and I certainly have. I always took the position I don't share my politics, and over the course of the last I don't know, 4 years or so, I have found that there's the increasing exception to that rule. I did speak out against this topic, and then there was this topic and that one, and so it's just not quite as bright a line as it used to be.
Yeah. Imagine teaching during the 1828, 1832 campaign with Jackson, and how you would feel, or maybe even during the lead up
especially in South Carolina.
Yeah. Or the Preston Brooks and Charles Sumner episode on the House floor. So, we are in very difficult times, and let's remind ourselves in teaching this content that these are not, they are difficult times for sure. And this is horrible in terms of what we're dealing with, but it's not unique to our history. And we are healing over a long period of time.
Yeah.
And what I hear from everybody is that we are all willing to listen.
Yeah.
And we're all willing to put it out there, what we are doing, and listening to and taking, like truly listening to what other people are saying and their reasoning behind it, and maybe taking some of it back with you, to your reflection place, wherever that is. I think we're all in this for the kids, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think any of us, I didn't hear anybody here say, I'm saying stuff to indoctrinate the kids, because by golly, I'm going to raise a generation of fill in the blank voters.
Yeah. Better citizens.
Yeah. I mean, we want to raise citizens who can talk to each other, who feel comfortable in the space that we have provided to talk about things.
Yeah.
Much like this space that we have here. And it's interesting, Peter went onto Facebook and to the forums and was copying and pasting things that people had said about this very topic. And we were looking at it before. Most of it was related to behavior and or language that is being used, the rhetoric and the behavior, more so than the actual, or more so than some of the policy. Not that policy is somewhat tied to that. But a lot of it is about just being human, and you got to call it out when somebody is not treating people humanely.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
So I want to thank everybody for coming tonight, especially my other East Coast peeps, because, we've been up for a long time.
Yeah, I feel like there's a West Coast bias. I feel like Peter, it's 6 o'clock here and it's 9:10. I feel bad.
Yeah.
We always host it for the West Coast.
We have smoke out here, though. I can't even breathe where I am.
Yeah, me neither. But so thank you, East Coast folks who stay up late for this. I appreciate it. I know you guys got to work.
The night is very young here on the East Coast. I don't know.
Well, you can go ahead and send some pictures out from where you're headed out after this. That'll be entertaining. Peter, thanks for putting this together.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Jen and
Thanks,
Tom,
everyone.
thank you so much. Have a good night, everyone.
Jen, Tom, thank you. David, Carlo, all of you. Have a good night, everybody.